Welcome back after that short little break. We're now going to listen to Josh Simmons, and he's got a talk on open source citizenship.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you so much for having me here today. I would like to begin with slides that work and a clicker that works. That would be ideal. I would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the land and the traditional families of the Yagamba region of southeast Queensland, including the Kombumberi, Mununjali, Wanganarabura, and others, and their elders past, present, and emerging. My name is Josh Simmons, and I'm a short stack web developer and open source advocate. Currently, I do open source strategy for Salesforce, and I serve as the board director and vice president of the Open Source Initiative, the organization that stewards the open source definition and the process by which new licenses are vetted and added to the OSI-approved license list. Now, this is the last time I'll be giving this presentation, and every other time I've given it, I've done it with the inimitable Kat Allman, who isn't able to be here today, but deserves recognition for her role. Thank you, Kat. Kat is a 3-time board member of the Usenix Association, a coordinating committee member for teachingopensource.org, and an advisor to the Open Collective. She's been engaged with the open source community development since before we called it open source. And today, I want to talk to you about open source citizenship. The free software movement officially began in 1983, and at the time, it was radical. In '98, open source was coined as a way to encourage the adoption of free software by corporate players. Now, free, libre, and open source software, or FLOSS, is everywhere. To say nothing of the way this approach to intellectual property and collaboration is shaking up other fields, now, in 2020, FLOSS is an inextricable part of the global infrastructure, and it has massively accelerated innovation and developer productivity. As we discover the many benefits of embracing FLOSS, we also begin to understand that our compliance efforts as companies are just table stakes. This is when it dawns on us that the health of the projects we rely on is an existential concern. Ditto our relationships with these projects. Healthy projects offer regular releases, reliable security response, and new development from more people than we could ever hire. Unhealthy projects, that's a risk. This is why, collectively, many companies are investing in the health of open source communities, which is great and necessary, and we need more of it. But health is hard to define, hard to measure, though getting easier thanks to the work of groups like the Chaos community. And while much has been made of the struggle for open source projects to get the financial support they need, we can't just throw money at the problem. Complex problems aren't solved only with simplistic solutions. We need corporations to be good citizens of open source, and citizenship is a lot more than paying parking tickets. So, about open source citizenship. Kat and I have been doing research, talking to leaders from corporate open source programs offices, maintainers from open source communities, and leaders in nonprofit foundations. Now, today, I want to talk about what companies are currently doing to support open source communities, what forms of support open source communities are actually asking for, and how we can foster a culture of open source citizenship at our companies. And lastly, how projects can make it easier for companies to support them. So this is a bit of a two-sided talk. But first, I would like to take a quick detour and acknowledge that there's a much broader conversation that we need to be having. And Donna Benjamin this morning, and at least a dozen other speakers here at LCA are touching on it, and that is ethics. While this talk is at its core about taking a more expansive view of the role companies should play in open source, that they should not be just consumers, but citizens who contribute back beyond their own interests, I feel there's an even more expansive view that we should be taking. At this moment, tech companies and open source licensed technologies are being used to do wonderful things and perpetrate human rights violations. Thus, we are rightly having conversations about how we can center justice and how we can prevent our work from being used to do harm, and then how we can use collective organizing, regulation, perhaps even licensing to achieve those ends. Let's continue those conversations, and if you yourself have not been a part of those conversations, I ask you to please add your voice, because we need to hear them. Okay, with that said, let's dive in. What are companies doing today to support open source communities? The obvious one, upstream contributions. If at my company I'm using an open source project and I need to make an open source modification to that project, I damn well better upstream that contribution so that everybody else can benefit from it. That's just obvious. Contributing back into projects allows everybody to benefit and also saves you from working on an internal fork of the project, which inevitably results in massive technical debt and ultimately pain. Not just contributing back your modifications and improvements to those projects, but also open sourcing your lateral contributions. If I'm using Drupal and I develop some Drupal modules for my business, well, I should open source those as well, add to the value of not just Drupal, but the whole ecosystem around it. The same thing is true of operating systems and all the user space applications around those. Companies, although this is less common, companies also have paid contributors on staff. Sometimes this is full-time, sometimes this is part-time, but anything at all is great. Companies should hire out of open source communities when they can to make sure that the people who are driving these projects forward have the security that they need to be able to continue that work. At Google, we have the maintainers of Git, Samba, and numerous Linux kernel developers. At Salesforce, we have numerous Apache committers across several different projects. Companies are, of course, also sponsoring, supporting projects with money and other kinds of supports. Not just projects, but also events and communities around those projects. Now, this one is near and dear to my heart. Companies are also running mentorship programs. In fact, not just companies are running these things. There are also nonprofits that are running these things. Some great examples would be Google Summer of Code from Google, Outreachy from Software Freedom Conservancy, Rails Girls Summer of Code, the Season of Docs, X.org's Endless Season of Code, you name it. There are other programs also, such as Teaching Open Source, which is training computer science professors on the basics of open source software so that they can take that knowledge back to their students. The key here is that we're all investing in making sure that new people are entering the community as contributors. Companies are also beginning to share their experience more openly, their experience of how they use open source software, what their policies are, and how they decide what they use and how they give back. For one example, there's the To-Do group. It's an organization that is a collection of companies with large investments in open source. These companies are comparing notes, sharing what their policies are, trying to understand how to navigate the intricacies of both maintaining healthy relationships with the communities, as well as making sure that they're abiding by the compliance obligations in the open source licenses. One great example would be Google's open source documentation, which they open sourced, so that it makes it that much easier for the next company to begin adopting open source software and then contributing back to it. So here is roughly the things that we know companies are doing today to support open source communities. There are a lot of, these things take a lot of different forms. I believe last year, Indeed launched their FOSS Fund program with the help of Open Collective, wherein their employees who are contributing to open source projects are given an opportunity to nominate projects that they use to receive a grant. And then the people who have contributed to open source also get a chance to vote on those projects, and the projects that win in that quarter or month or whatever the time period is then receives a $10,000 grant. However, what companies provide is not the same as what communities are actually asking for. So what are communities asking for? What kind of support are they looking for? This is one that comes up all the time in conversation for me. I think it goes without saying that in open source, we put code on a pedestal. We have sort of a code supremacy world in open source, and I think that's to our detriment. You know, lots of projects were developed by developers for developers, and so the user experience caters to developers. But for us to really realize the user freedom that animates the free software and open source movements, we need to have software that can be used by more than just developers. And frankly, who doesn't like a usable piece of software? So I hear a lot of communities asking for volunteer designers, for user interface and user experience experts, for product management. Oh my gosh, documentation. Please, please get your technical writers contributing to projects. And not just that, data science. Maybe analyzing contributions and understanding when you've got a gap in, when you've got problems with contributor retention, or understanding the usage of the software. And lastly, marketing and PR. I mean, what good does it do us to have open source projects if nobody knows they exist, or nobody knows how to explain them to users or contributors that haven't heard of it before? These are all skills that are absolutely essential to good software. And yet, code still dominates. And so I would really encourage people to try to find these other skill sets and bring them into the fold. Give them on-ramps into contributing to your open source projects. And if you are at a company and you know people who have these skills, or you have these skills, please contribute them. I hear a lot of projects ask for companies to contribute beyond what the company needs. I think it makes a lot of sense that businesses tend to contribute back things that are directly related to their business interests. That's not surprising for anybody. But we need more than that. For instance, how great would it be if one of your senior developers was offering to do code review on other features that other contributors are giving to the project? You know, when we realize that the business that we're in has an existential relationship with the open source projects that they use, then it goes back to the point I made earlier about those relationships and how much those matter. Because if I've used your piece of software, and maybe I've upstreamed some of my contributions, some of my changes, but your project is suddenly going through a conversation about its technical direction, what's in scope for its roadmap, what do you want to do next? And I enter that discussion having never really been a member of the community, having never really carried the weight to nurture that relationship and make sure that it's not just a transactional relationship, then why would you give any credence to what I have to say? So not only would it be good for the communities around these open source projects if companies were giving beyond their needs, but it would be good for those companies because then those companies would have a little more goodwill and perhaps a little more influence in those conversations about the technical direction of these projects. I also hear communities asking for testing and QA resources. Also, just generally, infrastructure. It costs money to host these things. It takes server time to run the tests every time someone makes a new contribution to see if there's a new regression or something. This costs money. And some of us work for cloud providers. Some of us have those resources to offer. And so we should do that. We should also fund conference travel for contributors. Because suffice it to say, there are some things that you just cannot do over a mailing list or in an IRC channel. But you know that because you're here at a conference. You know the value of face-to-face interactions, and you know that they're irreplaceable. For me, with the open source initiative, we're a pretty scrappy nonprofit, but we still pay twice a year to have all of our board members meet in person, because while we may be able to transact the basic business of the board through email and monthly calls, there's nothing like being locked in a room together for a day to really hash out the difficult conversations, to figure out what the vision is and where we're going. So you can fund not only conference travel for contributors, maybe fund hosting their event space or whatever event that project needs to hold to move itself forward. Relatedly, event space. I know increasingly a lot of us are remote workers, but even if we're remote, our company tends to have an office somewhere. And that space is golden. That is a hell of a resource that we should be sharing with these communities. Because again, some things just need to happen face-to-face. And that event space might be for a meetup, it might be for a summit or a sprint, whatever it is. If you have access to event space, provide it. Better if it's close to mass transit, has good connectivity, and you can provide some catering. But honestly, event space is enough. I also hear this one a lot. I don't know what employment contracts are like in Australia. I'm from the US, if you couldn't tell from my accent. But I know what my employment contract says. And I know what my last employment contract said. And it said that anything that I did on company time or company resources belonged to the company. In fact, some contracts, in fact, many of them in the US in particular, go as far as to say that anything you do while you are in the employ of that company, they have the first right of refusal. Whether it's just a shower thought you had or some good idea you had in a conversation, even if it's not relevant to the business's interest, they have the first right of refusal to own that idea. And that is ridiculous. That is hostile. So I'm going to give a shout out here to a newish thing that Software Freedom Conservancy is working on, which is the Contract Patch Program. You can find talks about it. I think they have some blog posts about it. I really encourage you to look at it. The gist of it is this. When you are looking for that next job, you've done your interviews, you finally get that offer, you feel great. Seize that moment when you have an offer and you have not yet accepted, because in that moment you are more powerful than you will ever be with respect to your employer. Because they have invested untold thousands of dollars in trying to find you, in trying to bring you out to their office to interview you. And for every you that they found, there were tens, if not hundreds of people that applied for that role that they didn't hire or give an offer to. It is costly to hire somebody. And so when you have an offer in hand, they don't want to walk away. This is when you should negotiate, not just for salary, not just for vacation, but also for your intellectual property rights. And you know what? I was talking to somebody earlier this week who successfully did this. Now, I'll admit that for me, I'm still pretty early in my career. I don't feel like I could successfully accomplish that even if I asked for it. But I should try. Because you know what? These companies are desperate for qualified talent. I hear often about how hard it is to find talent, and if they are in a bit of an arms race to find good people to work for them, it is really important that they know that salary isn't the only thing that we're after, that we also value our intellectual property rights. And the more we ask for that, even if we're not successful in achieving it, they will begin to notice. So again, just a shout out, Software Freedom Conservancy, the contract patch program. Please give this signal to the recruiter the next time you get an offer. I also hear communities asking for jobs for the maintainers of these projects. You know, it's been a few years since Heartbleed, and the discussion of open source sustainability has evolved quite a lot since then. But there are still hundreds, if not thousands, of open source projects where the maintainers are making a subsistence living at best. Not only is that unjust, but frankly, that's a risk for the business. Why would I want to use software that isn't being maintained? So pay the people. And you know, if you can't hire them, at least contribute to their Patreon or pay them somehow. Related to this, although slightly different, I've also heard communities asking for the placement of senior employees in their communities. Open source and free software lives and dies by a culture of mentorship. If we do not build welcoming communities, if we do not build on-ramps for new contributors and ways to retain those contributors and help them grow to become new maintainers, then the project has no future. Again, that's bad for business too, but that's bad for the project. And so within our companies, we have junior developers, junior technical writers, we have people who are senior as well. We have architects. We should be trying to carve out time for these people to be among the community and be part of that mentorship solution, which is essential for the longevity of these projects. So I had a number of friends who went through university and got computer science degrees. And the amount of practical experience they had when they finished was embarrassing. They had a dusting of intellectual property, mostly focused around don't plagiarize. Very little to do with open source and free software licensing. Not only did these friends of mine get out of university without really understanding the intellectual property framework that we're operating within, but most of them hadn't really used version control. Most of them hadn't done a whole lot in the way of working with test suites. When students are in university, that is a great opportunity for them to get real practical experience through contributing to free and open source software. There's something that you can do for students if they're contributing to open source software. You can provide them with a curricular practical training letter. That is what many offices at universities look for to recognize that, oh, this student has done something that is worth course credit. So then we're incentivizing students to contribute to open source software. And even if they don't stick around in a particular project, they've at least learned how to work with other people, work remotely, use all the tools of modern software development. And they'll also have a taste of what it means to be a part of an open source community. And if you're here, you're probably already a part of a community, and you know how much that means. I've also heard a number of communities ask for companies to abide by community norms. This might mean using their IRC channel, or their Slack instance if they have one. This might mean using their mailing list, or getting involved with the normal cadence of their release cycles and their planning. This might also mean using the same license as that project and community. For instance, there are licenses that are fairly standard within each language ecosystem, and this is true within the framework ecosystems as well. You know, there's one license that's common within JavaScript. There's another that's common within Java. So if your company is using those projects, making lateral contributions to the ecosystem, releasing new things on top of that software, use the same license. Basically, this is just about respect and meeting people on their own terms, because the communities don't work for you. They don't work for us. The community is a self-identifying group of people who share interests and are working together to a roughly common vision. And if you don't abide their norms, if you're not respectful of the things that they consider important to them, the things that they have already established as the way they work, well, good luck with that interaction. So in sum, you might notice that this is a longer list than the one before. Companies are doing more and more to support open source software communities. But we're not doing enough. So about that, how can we take the companies that we belong to, the companies that we start, and how can we cultivate a culture of open source citizenship? How can we change the direction so that the companies become more, invest more back into the community so that the relationship is slightly more reciprocal at least? Now this could be the subject of a whole series of talks. And admittedly, this is a less developed area of our research. But it boils down to just a few things. Enumerate and value your dependencies. Do you know what open source projects are in your dependency graph? Do you know how many corners of your code base are reliant on those things? Do you know how much CPU time is spent running FFmpeg or leftpad? If you don't know what you're depending on, and if you don't understand how what you're depending on relates to your bottom line and the revenue that your company is making, how could you ever make the case that you should be giving back more to these communities? So the first thing that you can do, even if you're not the director of open source or the CTO or the founder, just as an individual contributor, if you can carve out some time to begin enumerating your dependencies and understanding what your company's relationship to them is, then you can make a case to your leadership that your business depends on these projects. And that not only should you give back to these projects because it's generous, it's a nice thing to do, but because it's an investment. You're minimizing risk, for goodness sake. That's something business leaders tend to understand. But then you have to incentivize contribution. If you're rewarded in performance review for contributing to open source, you're more likely to do it. And the reverse is true as well. We need to find ways to incentivize the people that work in our companies to contribute to open source. And then you've got to raise internal awareness. Not only do people need to know what you're dependent on, not only do people need to know that you encourage them to contribute to open source, they need to know that this is a possibility for them, and this needs to be an ongoing awareness campaign. This needs to be something that is documented within your intranet. This needs to be something that is brought up in training. This needs to be something that is brought up in all-hands meetings. Here are the top 10 contributors from this month, or here's a dinner for all the people who contributed to open source this quarter. There are lots of ways to incentivize and then also raise awareness of these things. Speaking of training, and including this in your training, you have to train, train, and train. No one is born knowing everything they need to know. I heard that on the stage earlier today. You need to help your people be better by supporting learning within your company. We've all seen job ads that ask for 10 years of experience in a language that's only existed for 2. Don't be that company. Train your people, and they might be the inventors of the next big thing for your business. They might be the inventors of the next big thing that the whole industry relies on. I'll also add here that I started my career as a freelance web developer, and I was doing that for about 13 years before I even began to understand that something novel was happening. I had been doing Drupal web development for over a decade. I had been selling Drupal. And it never occurred to me to ask, why is it that there's this awesome piece of software that I can configure and then sell? It didn't dawn on me until 13 years in, when I happened to get laid off by my company and I had 7 months to reflect on my life. And then not only did I realize that the licensing is novel, remember, this stuff was radical. This may be standard today, but this stuff was radical. It took me 13 years to understand that licensing was novel. And then it took me even longer to make my first open source contribution. And that was terrifying. As a freelance web developer, no one was looking at my code. And that was a great relief, because my code was not elegant. It worked, so it matters, I guess. But there was no test coverage. I wasn't using version control. Did I have a style guide? No. These are things that are not necessarily obvious to people. And it's not even obvious to people who are reasonably far along in their careers. Now, not only is there the unknown of like, oh, there are these tools and these expectations around the code style, but then what about the code review process? No one had reviewed my code. I was terrified of being judged. Oh my God, what a thought. What would they say? Not only that, even if you have people who work with you who use version control and code to a style guide, even if they do code review with you, you may be a small team with a rapport, and they may be comfortable doing code review because they know you. Putting anything into the unknown is terrifying. So if you can hold a hackathon or a hack day or a sprint or a whatever, if you could hold an event where you can give people an opportunity to make that first contribution to open source, you've demystified the whole thing. That is the hardest step. If you get somebody to make that first contribution, everything else starts happening a lot faster. So train your people. And be patient. Because open source is a collaborative process. It takes time. Also, culture change takes time. It's difficult. It may seem faster to just do the work in-house. Maybe it would be. But then you have random code in your code base that you are on the hook for maintaining for the rest of your company's existence. Wouldn't you like to have some help with that? Wouldn't you like to have the benefit of bug fixes that somebody else created? Feature development, novel ideas that you wouldn't even consider? So these are the things that, if I had to distill everything I've heard and learned down into a few bullet points, these are the things that I would say are really important for cultivating a culture of open source citizenship at your company. And all of us can contribute to that, whether we're leaders, individual contributors, somewhere in between. So I straddle the worlds of for-profit and nonprofit. I have for a long time. And I've got to say, it's not always easy to offer help. So me with my business hat on, and you with your open source contributor and maintainer hat on, or your meetup organizer or conference organizer hat on, help us help you. First of all, make it easy to learn about your project. If you don't want new contributors or users, make your site difficult to find, hard to read, and really vague about what your project actually does. Bonus points if your code base is needlessly complicated, crufty, or obscure. But honestly, if I at least have an about page to read, that's a great step forward. Be upfront about how your project works. How are decisions made? What are you looking for? What do you actually need? How can we get involved? How can we get our staff to upstream to your projects? How can we send you money? Oh, and make it clear what license your code is under as well. These are all relevant things. We want to know that the investment we're making in your project is going to be used diligently. This seems obvious, but you would be surprised. I cannot write you a personal check for your bank account. I can't just PayPal you something. I mean, some edge cases, maybe. But really, you ought to have a way to receive money. And that's not just about, like, oh, here's a payment method. We take credit cards and checks, wire transfers too. No. This is about having an organization that backs your project. Now, I've been known to say that building organizations is hard. And that's because it's true. The good news is that you don't have to build an organization. I believe here at Linux.conf Australia, they call their fiscal sponsor their auspice. In the States, we often call them fiscal sponsors. Basically, the nonprofit organization that provides the backing for your projects. One of the projects I'm involved with is North Bay Python. We're a scrappy little Python conference in the cutest cow town there is. And I really want to underline the word scrappy there. We do not have a lawyer. We do not have a bank account. We don't have accounts receivable, accounts payable. We don't have an accountant. Except wait, we do, because North Bay Python is a member project of Software Freedom Conservancy. Whether it's Software Freedom Conservancy, the Apache Software Foundation, Eclipse Foundation, Software in the Public Interest, Linux Australia, Drupal Association, WordPress Foundation, there are literally dozens of these organizations. And what they do is they provide a project with the backing, with the resources that it needs, so that you don't have to worry about the administrivia so much. Now, it's non-trivial to be a member project. It's not hard, but it's not trivial either. And sometimes your project is so new that maybe you're not a good fit. Maybe one of these organizations isn't ready to take a bet on you, but you've still got options. There are funding platforms that will provide a lightweight way to receive money and spend it in a transparent fashion. For instance, Open Collective. There are other platforms out there, but that's really the one that I trust most right now. But seriously, have a way to receive money. And then have a plan for how to use it. That could be having a roadmap. That could be having a wish list. That could be having a sponsor prospectus. We want to know what you're going to do with that money. And frankly, if you don't have a plan for how to use it, and then you get it, let's just say, conversations get way more difficult the moment money's involved. And if you don't already have a plan in place, good luck. Good luck. And be prepared to work with corporate timelines. We are slow. We are so slow. I'm so sorry, but we're slow. And we have annual budget cycles. We've got our fiscal year. Our money may not be allocated till this month. And then, maybe towards the end of the fiscal year, we understand, oh, we found some money in the cushions that we haven't spent yet, and we've got to spend it quickly. Know who the companies are that you're seeking funding from. Get to know a contact there. Learn what their fiscal year is, what their budget process is like. And then be ready to work with that. Be ready to work with net 30, net 60, God knows what. But just be prepared to work with corporate timelines and get started early so that doesn't cause any trouble for you, especially if you're running something time sensitive like an event. And then be prepared to onboard new contributors. It's great to have documentation for your users. That's essential to a healthy project. But what about your contributor documentation? How do I make my first contribution to your project? Is there a path to becoming a maintainer or a committer? Tell me. Tell me. Put these resources together so that I, with my business hat on, can not only send you money or give you event space or give you cloud compute resources, but also direct my staff to contribute to your project. These are all the ways that you can help us help you. And I get it. I get it. Open source is like a labor of love. It's volunteer driven. This is not easy. And here I am, person wearing a business hat, asking you to do things so that we can support you. But I'll tell you what, if you can address these things, it will be so much easier to make that happen. And if you work with a fiscal sponsor, you're going to have a lot of this in place already. That is all I have for you today. Thank you.